We are talking today with Todd Miller. Todd Miller has researched and written about U.S.-Mexican border issues for more than 15 years. He has worked on both sides of the border for Border Links in Tucson, Arizona, and Witness for Peace in Oaxaca, Mexico. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Tom Dispatch, Mother Jones, The Nation, Counterpunch, and Al Jazeera English. He writes on border and immigration issues for NACLA Report on the Americas and its blog Border Wars. And he is here to talk about his new book, Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security. Todd, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
It's great to be here.
So start out, tell us, what was the motivation in writing Border Patrol Nation?
Border Patrol Nation, well, you can look at, there's a long story to it and a short story, but the in-between story, I guess we can go with is, I've been working on, as you mentioned, I've been working on border issues for years. I've worked on these issues in a number of different capacities. I've been directly on the border. I've worked with organizations. I've worked in Mexico and deep in Mexico, southern Mexico, where lots of people were choosing to leave their communities to go north or to go to other places in Mexico who are migrating for trying to find work, really. And so I've seen it from multiple perspectives. And I have to say, all those different experiences really, I drew off all these different experiences over the years, and when in all these different places, I've worked with both nonprofits, but I've also done a lot of reporting, and eventually, especially watching some of the rather dramatic changes around border enforcement in the post 9/11 era. And if you look at it just at the U.S. southern border with Mexico, and I'm based in Tucson, and I've been based there on and off since the late 1990s. What we've seen in Tucson and southern Arizona and pretty much along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border are fairly dramatic changes from what it was. Just if you go 21 years ago, for example, there weren't the walls. Like if people think about the U.S.-Mexico border now, they probably think of a gigantic wall. Well, that hasn't always been the case. 21 years ago in Nogales, there was no wall. It was a chain link fence with a lot of holes in it. So the idea that at one point there were these, fortified, secured borders like you might hear from people on the news or in the media or politicians is not true. This is a rather new phenomenon, and the kind of changes that we've seen are dramatic. And being a witness to those changes, there's operations in the mid-1990s, like the famous Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Safeguard, but it was the post 9/11 era. When lots of resources started going to border patrolling, lots of resources, especially when the U.S. Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection went under the Department of Homeland Security, and with that, they acquired a counterterrorism priority mission. And further with that came tons of resources, and the kind of landscape shifts that we've seen are just unreal. I mean, places that looked one way, 20 years ago look completely different, almost deranged, almost like they're unrecognizable to what they once were. So noting these kind of dramatic shifts and changes is what prompted me to write the book Border Patrol Nation, is looking at such dramatic shifts as I've seen on the southern border, but with these budgets growing like they have, with the agency expanding like it has, what are some of the surprising elements? How has it geographically expanded to other places where it wasn't before? How much is the United States actually becoming a border patrol nation? How is the interior, like in the middle of the country, are they acquiring sort of that kind of U.S. border model enforcement practices with their police? There's all kinds of different questions and lines of inquiry that I followed, but it was basically looking at that kind of those massive transformations and feeling, whoa, it's not, that a book needs to be written about this.
So talk more about that. Talk about the maybe a brief history of Border Patrol and what has changed since 9/11.
Yeah, so the brief history, if you just look at the U.S. Border Patrol alone, it wasn't formed until 1924. So we went from 1776 to 1924 without a Border Patrol at all. Um, After 1924, the agency grew slowly but steadily for about 70 years. However, with a different type of strategy. Like it went from about a couple hundred agents to about 4,000 agents, which, if you take the amount of growth that we've seen in the last 20 years, which in 1994 it was 4,000, and now it's about 23,000. So if you take those first 70 years, you're like, well, okay, you know, it was an agency that the federal government, I guess, was still cultivating, but was kind of an afterthought at the same time. And then now with 23,000 U.S. Border Patrol agents, but that's not the whole story. They're part of Customs and Border Protection, which is about 65,000 agents. That is the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country. Customs and Border Protection includes an Office of Air and Marine, which is basically an Air Force and a Navy. It's 65,000 is double the size of Ecuador's army. It's become a gigantic force. There's special forces units. The kind of militarization of the U.S. borders and the Border Patrol is quite evident. And if you start adding other elements to this, like, well, you have 65,000 in Customs and Border Protection, then you have 20,000 with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE. So you're at 85,000. Then you add in programs that they have with police forces, both on the border and in the interior of the country. And there's approximately 650,000 police. And we're talking astronomical numbers. We're talking a situation unlike we've ever seen before. When we look at, the 400,000 deportations that you hear about every year, this is what it's coming from. There's a whole huge, gigantic enforcement and incarceration expulsion apparatus that's been developed. And there's tons of money going into it. And for example, again, in the early 1990s, the budget for border and immigration enforcement was about $1.5 billion. And if you look at the fiscal year 2012, it was $18 billion. So, and that goes to CBP and ICE and a couple other agencies. That's almost 18 times more money being spent on this than in the last 20 years. That in another figure that's really showing is that number 18 billion is more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Like big ones like the DEA, FBI, all of them combined come to $14.4 billion. So this has become the huge priority for the U.S. federal government. And it involves personnel like Border Patrol, but also all kinds of technologies, surveillance technologies, the kind of technologies that people worry about, the kind of what some people would call intrusive technologies of surveillance that are just proliferating through the borderlands, and often, just to end the segment, often the borderland part is used as a laboratory to try out some certain surveillance equipments that are then, if they pass the test on the border, then are transferred to other places in the United States. So there's that element as well.
Define what the borderlands are, because one would picture it's, let's say, the Canadian and Mexican border, and 500 feet on both sides.
Yeah, good question. So probably when you say borderlands, there's two different ways to look at it. The one way is that residents, via the viewpoint of the residents, there's lots of people that live in, for example, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. It's almost, there's so much. It's a kind of there's a vibrant dynamic where Mexico meets the United States, for example, and Spanglish is spoken, so people speak Spanish and English, and it bleeds into like all the regions on both sides of the border, and you don't say frenar, like to brake, you say braquear. There's all kinds of you have that where residents say, "Well, I live in the borderlands," and then for our purposes here, there's also a legal definition of what is a border jurisdiction zone for the U.S. Border Patrol and the Department of Homeland Security, and that legal jurisdiction, which I would also refer to as the borderlands, refers to the actual international boundary line and then 100 miles inland. So if you take the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, and if you can imagine, say, an orange band going around the contour of the United States, imagine the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border going inland at 100 miles, and there's an orange band there, and then the 4,000-mile U.S.-Canada border and inland 100 miles. So there's another orange band, but it's not only that; it's the coast. So you go down the west coast, you go down the east coast, and you suddenly have a border jurisdiction where the U.S. Border Patrol can do roving patrols. They can set up checkpoints. They can do a number of things above and beyond what local law enforcement can do in those areas. And if you follow that orange band, you'll see that it'll devour the whole state of Maine. It devours the whole state of Florida. And it covers 2/3 of the U.S. population, approximately 200 million people. So that's massive. I mean, the majority of the U.S. is in a border zone by those definitions. And when you think about the expansion, like I was just mentioning, all the personnel, their surveillance equipment, you think, well, in North Carolina, we're not seeing the U.S. Border Patrol. And it's true. You're not seeing them necessarily on the coast of North Carolina. But I want to say the word yet. Right, it's in constant expansion. You were also 10 years ago. You were not seeing the U.S. Border Patrol in Erie, Pennsylvania. Where's the border in Erie, Pennsylvania? Well, it's the lake. It's Lake Erie. But lo and behold, there's a Border Patrol station there in Erie. And if you pull in on a Greyhound bus or if you pull in the Amtrak train, I'd say that U.S. Border Patrol agents will get on your bus and ask you your citizenship, or they'll get on your train and do the same. So there's all kinds of places and geographical locations that are considered the borderlands, right, where U.S. Border Patrol has shown up, now have stations, places where they have never been before. And people, when I did research in Rochester, New York, which also is right along the lake, people are just surprised. They're like, whoa, we haven't never had to deal with this new kind of police force that can set up checkpoints, that chase people into supermarkets, that get onto trains and buses, and et cetera, et cetera. So that would be the definition of the kind of legal definition, and it's what the ACLU has referred to as a constitution-free zone, and meaning that you're particularly focusing on the Fourth Amendment protection to search and seizure, that in those zones, if you go through a checkpoint, you can be interrogated and perhaps have a federal agent look through your belongings, if so alarmed. So that's pretty much what I mean. What borderlands would mean in the two different ways.
So 2/3 of the U.S. population is now in this constitution-free zone.
Yes.
And when the Border Patrol does these actions like what you've described, do they synchronize that with other law enforcement, or are they just acting on their own, or both?
It's both. Where I live in Arizona, Border Patrol just has their own checkpoints. They're usually doing patrols on their own. However, they are working closely with local law enforcement. In fact, I was just talking to somebody who was in southern Arizona a week ago. I was talking to them in Bellingham, actually, and they were in southern Arizona a week ago, and they were out in what we call the West Desert, and they were putting water out along routes where people border crossers might be crossing through there. So lots of times, people can't carry enough water, so they'll walk for days and days. So they're putting water on these routes, and the Border Patrol came up to them and asked them what they were doing. So they had a conversation with the Border Patrol, but then they went away. I guess it was a little tense. I wasn't there, so I can't. But then when another agent came back at a green stripe Border Patrol U.S. Department of Homeland Security vehicle, a sheriff or somebody from the, not a sheriff, but from the I think they said from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, but that could be wrong. It might have been another county in the area. But an officer from the Sheriff's Department got out of the car, not in a Border Patrol uniform, but in a police officer in his normal police uniform. And that just took them back. They were like, "What? You're not Border Patrol. You're a police." Well, it turns out they were doing a joint task force. So a lot of times, police agencies will kind of quote unquote lend their officers to the Border Patrol, and they'll do joint missions together as one way of collaboration on the southern border. Also, many police forces, local police forces on the southern border operate, and the northern border for that matter, operate with what's called Operation Stone Garden. Operation Stone Garden is a kind of grant system from the Department of Homeland Security that essentially gives local police a border security mandate. In other words, it pays them overtime if their police have to do overtime to do patrol, like a Border Patrol agent. Then they document that, and Operation Stone Garden will pay them for that overtime and pay them a lot. I've seen the figures. It's a lot of money, and also if police departments want to get equipment, like the kind of those technologies, usually surveillance technologies, to use to police the border, well, Operation Stone Garden provides, to some degree at least, the money to be able to buy some of this equipment. So Operation Stone Garden really sets up a collaboration between Border Patrol and police, and you see it, and obviously you see it a lot on the southern border, but this is a huge thing that you see on the northern border. And for example, checkpoints, like some of the checkpoints that I saw around Rochester, where I did a lot of research, were actually New York State troopers who are working with Operation Stone Garden, but they would set up a checkpoint, maybe a DUI checkpoint or something like that, and people would go through it. But then one Border Patrol vehicle would be with the police vehicles. So if a person were to go through this checkpoint and a New York State trooper were to think, well, or if that person couldn't provide a driver's license, or for whatever reason a state trooper thought, well, that guy, maybe, he's doesn't have documents. There's the Border Patrol right there, and they refer them to Border Patrol, and which is remarkable because you think about like Arizona, for example, gets all this notoriety, for SB 1070 and the kind of state laws that have been passed in Arizona, rightfully so. However, that's New York State, right? New York State, which is known for other things, known as this big blue liberal right state, yet this very same practices and the very same targeting practices of this very same undocumented people that are doing work there are happening, and people are like being funneled into this incarceration apparatus, and so there's those are just a couple examples of how the kind of police CBP Border Patrol collaboration. There's obviously also police Immigration and Customs Enforcement collaboration as well, more in the interior of the country, which has to do with people getting, pulled, if they're arrested or even pulled over, on a traffic violation, then their information will go through a database with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. If they're deemed to, if they don't have documents, then oftentimes they'll get funneled into the deportation system and be incarcerated, then deported from the country.
Do you know if any of this work is synchronized with the fusion centers?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know as much about the fusion centers, but it has to be because they're, Department of Homeland Security is working. I think they're DHS fusion centers, right? So there's local police and with in the fusion center. So you have DHS, local police. You're going to have border, you're going to have this with the DHS mandate, which is, a huge part of it is the border stuff and immigration enforcement. So yeah, fusion centers, I would guess are just another manifestation of this kind of, fusion is a good word, fusion of Homeland Security and local police.
So you mentioned how the vast amount of money that's being poured into this, can you talk about the companies, commercial entities, corporations that are involved in this?
Yeah, just you think of any company, particularly the first. If you want to think about, if you're wondering what companies are involved or could be involved in in border, yeah. So I guess to frame it, maybe you could start with with this. You look at the budget, it went from 1.5 billion to 18 billion. I mean, there's a lot more money with this border and immigration enforcement on an annual basis to spend on all kinds of stuff. And so, while there have been private interests and private companies getting contracts with border patrol or for a while in the last 10 to 15 years, especially when seeing like massive budget surges in border policing. We've seen an unprecedented level of interest from private sector. A lot of my research for Border Patrol Nation involved going to trade shows throughout the country, looking at trade shows, many of them that focused on border technology, where lots of different private companies would come. The main one is called the Border Security Expo. It's annually in Phoenix, Arizona. In fact, next week or coming up soon in April, there's the Border Security Expo, which I'm planning to go there, but I don't know. This year it seems like they don't want to allow me to enter the doors. So I'm having a little trouble with their media. I don't think they like critique too much. But anyhow, the Border Security Expo is where lots of high brass from Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, they all come, and more than 100 companies. Also, there's an exhibition hall where they display their wares, and they come and they're in a kind of conversation with each other about what is needed for the U.S. borders. And I say U.S. borders, meaning not just the southern border, also the northern border. And even there's more and more talk about the coasts. The coasts, people should be looking at the coasts because they are talking more and more about the coasts. So in those coastal areas, maybe there's nothing yet, but there's talk about it. So people who live in those areas should be thinking about that. So for example, next week, if you were to go to the Border Security Expo, you could walk into the big high-ceilinged exhibition hall, and you'll see like the banners of different companies. Raytheon is normally a top sponsor of the expo, but other companies that have gotten border security contracts before, like Boeing, are usually present. Lockheed Martin might have a big banner up. So when you think of large military manufacturers, you almost have to think that a lot of them are looking towards what has become and is becoming and what continues to be what the latest forecast that I read said is in an unprecedented boom period, and that is the border security market. So you go there, and there's just lots of vendors, and there's all kinds of different gear, and lots of equipment is stuff that has been used by the U.S. military in wars abroad. That I talked to one vendor who said that, well, with wars winding down in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, now because we were selling our equipment, to the army in these places or the military in these places, but that seems to be winding down a little bit. Well, that remains to be seen, right? But now we're looking for other markets, right? Like any business would, right? They want to keep that growth. They want to keep that 5% growth. So now they're looking for other markets, and boom, one of the big ones is what they call the border security market. And so that's very same equipment. So you could go to the U.S.-Mexico border, and probably a lot of places, even on the U.S.-Canada border, but especially on the U.S.-Mexico border, and find find equipment that was used in Iraq and Afghanistan, or find equipment that was used there, but companies rebranded them, gave them what they call a Homeland Security application, and then now are selling them to Customs and Border Protection or, Homeland Security in some capacity. So it's almost this idea of what one vendor said, we are bringing the battlefield to the border. This idea, you can see it, manifest itself on the U.S.-Mexico border primarily, and just to end that, one of the big things that we're seeing south of where I live in Tucson, and just about 12 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border, just north of Nogales, is these new towers. They're called integrated fixed towers. There's 7 of them that have been just constructed, and these are highly sophisticated towers. They have radar, they have cameras, they have night vision cameras, thermal energy cameras, and they are what they're doing is trying to build a technological barrier, or what they call a virtual wall. And the idea is that these cameras these towers with cameras that can see 7 miles away are connected with all this other surveillance equipment, such as motion sensors. And there's 12,000 motion sensors along the U.S.-Mexico border. So if somebody trips a motion sensor, then an agent in an operational control room will hear a beep, beep, beep sound, right? Or if the camera from one of these towers sees somebody 7 miles away or 4 miles away or 3 miles away, the agent will see the feed. Or if the radar gets somebody on the feed, well, the agent will see that. And it's also connected to the drones. There's surveillance drones flying over the borderlands, north and south. And so those feeds will also go into these operational control rooms. And that what they're calling it is a virtual wall. It's not really a wall. It's more like a technological barrier. It's another layer of wall. So it's almost like you no longer conceptualize the border as just a line, like we were discussing before. On the actual borderline, there's a wall. There's a concentration of technologies. Agents are concentrated there, especially in urban areas, especially in what were traditional migrant crossing points. Now there's what the strategy is layered. So if people get past that point, like they're usually funneling around the enforcement apparatus along the borderline, then they have to go through this virtual wall layer of enforcement. And then if they get past that, they have to get past the checkpoint system of roadside checkpoints, So there's layer upon layer upon layer of obstacles. And this particular virtual wall that I was mentioning, the company that got the contract for that is a company called Elbit Systems. It's an Israeli military manufacturer, and that's the primary, I believe, border technology integrator in Israel-Palestine. So it's transferring its technology and know-how from Israel-Palestine and the practices there to the U.S.-Mexico border.
So the same company and people that have that massive wall system in Palestine and Israel are partners here in the U.S. now.
Exactly.
Only a couple minutes left. So what are you hoping will come of your book?
Well, the book is it's a work of journalism. It's definitely trying to look into something that, the more I looked into it, the more alarming I found it. I mean, just in the level of awareness, even I've been working on this stuff for years and years, but even before I started the research on this book, I didn't realize how, I got obviously one of the motivations to write the book is I understood that this thing was huge, right? But I didn't even realize the magnitude of it. It's gigantic, and one of the things that everyone should be wary of is that it's like a runaway train. It just keeps, and it's a runaway train that's growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and it just doesn't seem to stop. And if you look like the one, as you talk about border stuff, it's framed with this immigration reform, right? So you look at. But it's framed with immigration reform in the sense that, and this is in Washington, and the idea that, oh, like, for example, there's a bipartisan bill passed by the Senate in June of 2013. That bill was, heralded, this is the immigration reform bill. Obama, when he was doing his executive actions, when he was announcing them last November, he mentioned that bill. He said that was a bipartisan bill. I don't know why y'all couldn't have passed that. I would have signed that, and it's 1,000 pages long, and it has important things in it, especially for people in the United States who are undocumented and who want their status regularized. They want a regular status, and there's a process in there, a kind of what they called a roadmap implemented within that immigration reform, which has its pros and cons. I guess it's not as easy as you might think it is, and people have to do a lot of things and bend over backwards. But at least it's there, and that's an important element. But one part of that 1,000-page immigration reform bill was also this approximately $46 billion put towards border stuff, and one of it was 19,000 new U.S. Border Patrol agents. So I just want to pause there and let that sink in. 19,000 new U.S. Border Patrol agents in an immigration reform bill. That's practically doubling. If you go from 1994 to 2015, you go 4,000 to 23,000. That's historic growth. It's never expanded at that rate ever before. And then with one bill, it was going to double again. How could that not be news? How could that not raise alarm bells? That would literally double this force, which, as we know, as we've been discussing, also works with police. So they have their force multipliers. And it also within the bill was, billions of dollars put towards technologies, including, doubling the fleet of drones. There was more money for walls and fences and stuff like that. And what my question I think I would pose is how is that acceptable? It goes in there. Some people characterize it, well, that's a bitter pill we have to swallow to get immigration reform. But everyone at the end of the day agrees with it. It's like, okay, we have to put this in order to get this other stuff passed. But the problem is that this creates this enforcement incarceration apparatus, which is just going to arrest more people, put more people in jail. It doesn't really solve anything. And it certainly doesn't look at this whole situation. It's like frames this whole situation in a way that, oh, let's regularize, people who are undocumented in the country, but put up this bigger wall. So we like thinking that we could actually stop people. And then the reality is, it's just it's yet again choosing a militarized, almost like going to war. You can almost think of that. Sociologist Timothy Dunn referred to it as a low-intensity war doctrine, what we have on the U.S.-Mexico border, and I would argue more and more on the U.S.-Canada border, a kind of low-intensity war doctrine that is being applied to this border policy. So it's essentially going to war and creating a militarized approach to what is ultimately a socioeconomic situation. And like the majority of people who cross our borders are people who are basically, in a lot of cases, feel uprooted because of a certain an economic system, a global economic system. In Mexico, more pronounced by NAFTA. If you look at the North American Free Trade Agreement and just look at how small farmers have done against large U.S. subsidized agribusiness, and you see millions of farmers have lost their livelihood over the years, millions. And when you lose your livelihood, like anyone, anywhere, losing their job, you have to look for another job somewhere else, which means like a lot of farmers have moved to the urban areas in Mexico. A lot of them have come north to the United States. So what I want to bring up by that is that we have to almost shift it. If there's one thing that maybe people could take away from Border Patrol Nation is like this idea of building up walls and borders and all that other stuff is not the right approach to what is ultimately there's a more holistic way we can go about looking at this gigantic problem. And also the last thing I just want to mention is that if you look at all this money that's coming into this and you think, whoa, we're building more walls, we're putting more Border Patrol agents, we're getting more technology, but yet like the city of Detroit, people in the city of Detroit don't have access to water, or people are losing their homes, or if you think about security, I mean, security isn't the roof over your head, isn't that, true security, that you can feel like you can go to your home, sleep under a roof, and, wake up, feeling safe in your own home. And yet, housing is constantly cut across the board, while at the same time we're bolstering without much debate, without hardly any debate, this kind of homeland security system. That in other words, I think that money, if we're really thinking about security in a real holistic sense, could be better spent elsewhere.
All right. Well, on that note, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.